Daniel Tulloch Tokawingua. My name is Daniel Tulloch. It's a pleasure to be here today. I am an independent climate change consultant, but I am also a Target alumni, having completed my PhD in the Department of Accounting and Finance, actually with Sebastian here. After my PhD, I started a career in research and sustainable finance, specializing in consulting with governments around the world. And then I had a policy career and moved into policy consulting. What I'd like to share today is some of the tips I wish I knew in that early career, which would have helped me get my ideas to the right desks and hopefully start to influence the policy decision-making process. And I've research, but the one gap that I keep seeing is that data and research doesn't always get into the policy making in the way that we expect it to. So I hope my tips today will help you be part of that climate change mitigation conversation. Annoyingly, I'm the third person to do this, but I have 3 points. The first one is understanding the machinery of government. The second is do not underestimate the importance of science communication, specifically outside of academia. And third, understand the value of being part of that conversation, and that should give you the incentive to be part of it. I'll move on to that first point. It's no surprise, as Minister Shaw mentioned, that governments all around the world wield a significant amount of resources and a significant amount of influence over policy. They are best placed to make large-scale changes to our society. They can regulate particular industries, they can allocate funding, mobilize action and communities. And so for that reason, we have to find a way to bridge the gap between academia and government. Now, when I stepped out of my academic life into my research and policy role, I made a few very early mistakes that I hope you don't make as well. I did a very quick internet search and I found any entity that had biodiversity, climate, environment in its title or on its website. And I made the assumption that was the place I had to go to. They were the decision makers. So I'd fire off my papers and say, please read it, please read it. What I've since learned over the years is that governments are increasingly trying to collaborate in the way that they respond to climate change risks. It's a multifaceted problem. Some describe it as an environmental problem. I describe it as a human problem. It's going to touch every individual, every community, every part of our nation. And so they often bring different skills, different perspectives, different views to the table. I failed on 2 things. I wasn't very clear on who I was pitching, and I wasn't clear on why. I'm going to give you some tips to hopefully answer those 2 questions for an academic. The first thing is understand who's part of a particular decision-making network. As we learned today, in the emissions reduction plan, there's 53 entities that have a role. In the national adaptation plan, there's 15 entities. I'm not suggesting you email all of them your papers. But what you can do is start to narrow down to who are the important agencies and the right desks I need to get my papers to. The way that you can do that is you can go to those entities and you can look at what their strategic vision is. How do they see themselves? What is their role in this conversation? You can also go to legislation and look for something called a statutory purpose or a statutory function, which is a little bit jargony. To break it down, it essentially says, here is how that particular entity sees the world. This is the functions and powers that that entity has. And then you need to craft your message to be relatable to that entity and what they can do in this conversation. Same thing if you're approaching ministers as well. Look at what they're doing and look at their manifestos. This is going to move me on to my second point. Do not underestimate the importance of science communication. I wouldn't describe it a fond memory, but quite a strong memory. When I stepped out of academia and started my policy career, I came from a finance background, very strong econometrics, and I was part of a conversation about robust market design. And I said this phrase that's stuck with me since. Sebastian might know what I'm talking about. And I said, have you considered using a generalized autoregressive conditional heteroscedasticity model with endogenous structural breakpoint tests? Now, for me in my academic circle, that was a standard model. But outside of academia, it was just, I might as well have been talking in hieroglyphics. The thing I failed to understand was 2 points of science communication: comprehensible and relatable. Your message has to meet both of those points. I obviously failed on being comprehensible. I also failed on being relatable, and that is because the models that I was used to in academia were very different to what policy uses. You have to go and look at the entity you're going to speak to and see what kind of models they use, and look at the kind of frameworks that they use. Try to speak their language, look at the kind of problems they're trying to face. Look what's on their work program. Join that part of the conversation, and it makes it easier for them to understand your research and factor it into their decision-making and their advice. I'll also say that it's probably useful to go and look at the policy process generally beyond that entity. What happens once their advice goes into cabinet committees and into cabinet, and then you get an idea of the kind of stages you have to go through to get your advice to the right table. I also want to suggest that academics become part of the existing structures that government has. So you'll see quite often that government puts out consultation papers, and in that paper they're explaining what their pain points are. What do they want solved? What do they want advice on? Look at the questions they have out there and respond to those questions. Use that knowledge and innovative thinking in your head to give them the answers they need. It makes it a lot easier for them. You can also engage in other ways. You can write memos, write briefings, collective letters to these agencies as well, get things on their agenda. Now, if you achieve those 2 points, understanding the machinery of government and also not underestimating the importance of science communication, I think there's 5 benefits in terms of climate change mitigation. The first is we create a resilient economy and a resilient community. We have adaptive capacity. There's so much thinking in this room and in Dunedin and online. And we need to get that thinking out of your heads and into that conversation. The second thing is sustainability. As we've talked about many times, this is just not a problem for our generation. It's for the generations to come. We want enduring solutions. We want opportunities in the future. My third point is economic benefits. A lot of my academic colleagues are working on some cutting-edge ideas, and it'd be really good to get those ideas into those conversations. When we as policy analysts put forward ideas to ministers or to other agencies, we put forward options to choose among, and it'd be really good to get those ideas on the table as options to pick. The fourth thing is New Zealand is a beautiful country, and we want to keep it beautiful. We need to make sure that climate change mitigation activities are factored into all of our decisions. And that includes valuing biodiversity in our country, and it also includes valuing our natural capital here as well. And the fifth and final point is that we have an opportunity to be a global leader. We see ourselves as a green, clean country. And we can select best practice and develop best practice that suits our unique circumstances. And like I said many times now, all of those ideas are in your head. We just need to get those out and as part of the conversation. So in wrapping up my speech, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me here to talk. I just want to remind everybody that although I've discussed us being academics and policymakers, we in fact are all just humans and guardians of the country and the earth that we live on. We should be working together. We want to be remembered as the generations that faced climate change. First of all, with resolve. Second, using the knowledge in our minds. And third, with unity. Thank you.